The last gas station. When the gas station opened on Route 59, nobody in the town of Millhaven thought much of it. Just another neon-lit blip on the map, a convenience for those passing through. It sat on the edge of the woods, the trees looming dark and oppressive behind it, as if the forest itself were waiting to swallow the station whole. The sign flickered at night, sputtering between bright green letters spelling out, "Last Stop Gas." No brand, no logo, just the words hanging in the cold November air, casting a pale glow over the cracked asphalt. The attendants were the first thing people noticed, or rather what they didn't notice. The two men working the pumps always stood at the same angles, one slightly hunched, the other straight-backed, both staring out at the highway as if waiting for something. They didn't talk much, just nodded when someone pulled up, filled the tank, and handed back the change. Their eyes, pale and glassy, never blinked, never shifted, never left your face. Carol Sims, who ran the diner down the road, was the first to complain. "They gave me the heebie-jeebies," she said one morning over coffee, her words muffled by the hiss of the old percolator. "Didn't say a word when I asked for a receipt, just stood there staring. I ain't going back." But she did. Everyone did. The pull-it started with little things. Bobby Jenkins' truck stalled 3 miles past the station, even though he'd just filled the tank. The engine wouldn't turn over until he walked back, scowling as he handed over another 20. "Damn thing's cursed," he muttered, but the attendants only stared, motionless as ever. Susan Green swore she forgot her wallet after stopping there late one night. She didn't realize until she was halfway home, her headlights barely cutting through the fog. When she turned around to get it, the wallet was sitting right on the counter, as if she'd left it there on purpose. Then there was Tim Hargrove, who'd been out on one of his late-night drives, clearing his head. "I just needed to stop," he told his buddies at the bar the next day. "Didn't even need gas. But it was like my hands weren't my own. They turned the wheel, pulled me right in. The pumps were glowing, I swear it. Bright green, like, I don't know, fireflies or something. The unseen rules." By December, nobody in Millhaven could avoid talking about the station. It wasn't just a place to fuel up anymore, it was something else, something alive. The rumours spread fast, the way they always do in small towns. Some said the attendants were ghosts, others swore the gas was cursed, the fumes seeping into your brain, messing with your thoughts. Sheriff Dean McAllister decided to investigate after his deputy, Angie, came back from the station looking pale and glassy-eyed, her usual chatter reduced to monosyllables. "She's not right," Dean told his wife that night. "She just kept mumbling about the lights." Dean drove out to Last Stop Gas after midnight, his cruiser's headlights cutting through the fog. The station loomed up out of the darkness, its sign buzzing faintly, casting everything in an eerie green glow. The attendants were there, of course, standing in their usual spots, their eyes fixed on him as he stepped out of the car. "Evening," Dean said, his voice firm. "You boys got names?" Neither answered. One of them, the hunched one, tilted his head ever so slightly, like a dog hearing a distant sound. Dean felt a prickle of unease run down his spine. "Mind if I take a look around?" he asked. They didn't stop him, but they didn't move either. As Dean walked toward the small building, he felt the air shift, like he'd stepped into a different world. The windows were too clean, the kind of clean that made you nervous. Inside, the shelves were stocked with the usual road trip staples, chips, soda, beef jerky, but everything looked untouched, too perfect. And then he saw it, a door in the back, marked Employees Only. The handle was cold, almost icy under his palm. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The truth behind the door. The room was dark, save for a single flickering bulb. The walls were lined with monitors, each showing a different angle of the town, the diner, the school, the bar, Dean's own house. He stared, his mouth dry as one of the screens showed him, standing right there, staring at the monitors. "What the hell?" he muttered. Behind him, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Dean spun around, his hand on his holster, but no one was there. Just the faint smell of gasoline and something else. Something sharp and metallic, like blood. The monitors began to flicker, the images twisting and warping. On one of them, he saw himself again. Only this time his face was wrong. His eyes were wide and glassy, just like the attendants. Dean stumbled out of the room, his pulse hammering. The attendants were waiting for him outside, their heads tilted at identical angles, their pale eyes unblinking. "You can't leave," one of them said, his voice flat and hollow. "Not yet." The end of the road. No one saw Dean McAllister again after that night. His cruiser was found abandoned by the side of the road, the engine still running, the driver's seat empty. The townsfolk whispered about it, of course, but no one dared go out to last stop gas, not anymore, except they did. They always did. The pull was too strong, the lights too bright. The gas station, sitting at the edge of the woods, waited, patient, unyielding, for its next customer. The stranger at the diner. The morning started like any other in Millhaven. The diner, a small greasy rectangle of chrome and neon, sat at the edge of Main Street, waiting for its usual trickle of customers. Carol Sims, the owner, was wiping down the counter while the radio murmured a country tune in the background. Regulars like Bobby Jenkins and old Miss Grayson sipped their coffee, chatting about the weather and the rising price of gas. That was when he walked in. He wasn't from around there, that much was clear. Tall and thin, with a grey coat that hung loose on his frame, the stranger looked like he'd been walking for miles. His boots were caked in mud, and his eyes, sharp and pale, darted around the diner like he was cataloguing every face, every detail. "Morning," Carol said cautiously. She didn't like the way he made her feel, like the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. The stranger nodded and slid onto a stool at the counter. "Coffee," he said. His voice was calm, but had a strange rhythm to it, like he wasn't used to speaking much. Carol poured him a cup and placed it in front of him. He didn't drink it right away, just stared into the black surface like he was looking for something. "Passing through?" she asked, trying to sound friendly. He looked up at her and smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "You could say that." The predictions, hey. Begin. The stranger didn't order food. He didn't seem hungry. Instead, he turned to look at Bobby Jenkins, who was halfway through his scrambled eggs. "You might want to skip your hunting trip this weekend," the stranger said. Bobby froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "How'd you know I was going hunting?" The stranger shrugged. "Just a feeling. The woods can be dangerous, especially when the weather's about to turn." Miss Grayson laughed, though it sounded nervous. "Well, aren't you the mysterious one? You a fortune teller or something?" The stranger's gaze slid to her, his pale eyes unblinking. "Your niece in Clearwater. She's been thinking about calling you. Maybe you should pick up when she does." Miss Grayson's smile faltered. "How do you know about my niece?" she whispered. The stranger didn't answer. He turned back to his coffee, finally taking a sip. Unease spreads word spread fast in a place like Millhaven. By lunchtime, half the town had heard about the strange man at the diner. Sheriff Dean McAllister showed up, leaning against the counter with his hands on his belt. "What's your name, stranger?" Dean asked. The man looked at him and smiled that same cold smile. "Names don't matter much, but you might want to check the South Bridge tonight, around 11. Something's going to happen there." Dean frowned. "Is that a threat?" "Just advice," the stranger said. Carol noticed Dean's hand twitch near his holster, but the sheriff didn't pull his weapon. Instead, he turned and left, muttering under his breath. The bridge incident. At 10:45 that night, Dean parked his cruiser near the South Bridge. He'd told himself the stranger was just a kook, but something about the man had stuck with him. The way he'd spoken, so calm and certain. At 11:02, headlights appeared on the horizon. A pickup truck came barreling toward the bridge, its tires screeching as it swerved wildly. Dean turned on his lights and siren, but before he could move, the truck hit the guardrail and flipped, skidding to a stop just inches from the edge of the river below. The driver, a local named Jeff Harding, stumbled out, reeking of booze, but alive. Dean pulled him away from the wreckage, his heart pounding. The stranger had been right. The departure. The next morning, the diner was quiet. Carol, Bobby, and Miss Grayson sat in their usual spots, but none of them spoke. They kept glancing at the door, half expecting the stranger to walk in again. But he didn't. When Dean came by, he had a grim look on his face. "Went to check the motel," he said. "Clark says the guy checked out last night. Left no name, no credit card, nothing." "Who was he?" Carol asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dean shook his head. "Don't know, but I'll tell you this, he knew things he shouldn't have, and I don't think we've seen the last of him." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the diner's windows. Somewhere on the highway, far from Millhaven, the stranger was already moving on to his next stop, his pale eyes scanning the horizon for another town, another story. As the clock struck 12, the whispers faded into silence, leaving the night colder, darker than it had ever been. Clara stood motionless, her heart thudding in her chest, the words of the murmurs still echoing in her mind like a warning she couldn't escape. The house, now eerily still, seemed to close in around her, its walls holding secrets that would never be revealed. But Clara knew something now, something she couldn't unlearn. The whispers, the shadows, the fear. It was all part of something much older than her, something that had always been waiting for a soul like hers to hear its call. And somewhere in the dark she could feel it, the presence, watching, waiting. The house had a life of its own, and Clara would never leave. The murmur at midnight. The first night the sound started, most people in Grey Hollow brushed it off. It was a low hum, barely noticeable at first, like a refrigerator running in another room. But as the week went on, the hum grew louder. By the 7th night, you could feel it, a faint vibration under your feet, as if the earth itself was groaning. It always began at midnight. "Maybe it's just the wind," Sheriff Jake Russell said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Wind didn't make your teeth ache. Wind didn't crawl into your chest and settle there like a weight. And wind sure as hell didn't come from the direction of the old Fairview factory." The factory. The Fairview factory had been shut down for decades. Once a hub for textiles, it was abandoned after a fire gutted half the building back in 1983. Some folks in town claimed the fire wasn't an accident, but no one liked to talk about it. The factory loomed on the edge of town like a decaying corpse, its broken windows staring out at the world like empty eyes. And now, the hum was coming from there. People started having dreams. Not the usual kind of dreams, but strange, vivid ones. Carol Sims, who worked the late shift at the diner, dreamed she was drowning in black water while something whispered her name. Old Mr. Grayson, who hadn't dreamed in years, woke up screaming about a woman with no face standing at the foot of his bed. Even Sheriff Russell wasn't immune. In his dream, he was walking through the factory, the hum louder than ever, until it wasn't a sound at all but a voice calling his name. Nobody wanted to admit it, but the whole town was scared. The investigation. It was Tim Hargrove who finally broke the silence. Tim was young, brash, and more than a little drunk when he burst into the diner one night and slammed his fist on the counter. "Enough of this crap," he shouted. "If that noise is coming from the factory, let's go check it out." A few heads nodded, but most people avoided his eyes. Carol set down the coffee pot she'd been holding and crossed her arms. "You're out of your mind, Tim," she said. "Maybe," Tim shot back, "but at least I'm not a coward." Sheriff Russell, who'd been nursing a cup of coffee at the far end of the counter, sighed. "Fine," he said, standing up. "I'll go, but I'm not letting anyone else get hurt over this." Tim grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. Midnight at the factory. Russell and Tim stood outside the factory's rusted gates at 5 minutes to midnight. The air was heavy, and the hum was already starting, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to seep out of the ground, rising and falling like a heartbeat. "Still think this is a good idea?" Russell asked, gripping his flashlight. Tim didn't answer. He pushed the gate open with a loud creak, and they stepped inside. The factory was worse up close. The walls were blackened from the fire, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. Their footsteps echoed as they moved through the main hall, the hum growing louder with every step. "It's coming from downstairs," Tim said, his voice tight. Russell nodded. They found a set of stairs leading to the basement, the metal steps groaning under their weight. The hum was deafening now, so loud it felt like their skulls were vibrating. At the bottom of the stairs was a door. It was covered in strange, jagged symbols carved deep into the wood. Russell hesitated, but Tim didn't. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The source. The room was small and empty, save for a single machine in the center. It looked ancient, with gears and levers that didn't seem to belong to any kind of factory equipment. The hum was coming from it, louder than ever. "What the hell is that?" Tim whispered. Before Russell could answer, the machine's gears began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster. The hum shifted, becoming a low voice that seemed to speak directly into their minds. "You shouldn't be here," it said. Russell staggered back, his flashlight shaking. "Turn it off." Tim reached for the nearest lever, but the moment his hand touched it, he screamed. His body convulsed, his eyes rolling back in his head as the voice grew louder, filling the room with a terrible, resonant roar. Russell grabbed Tim and dragged him out of the room, slamming the door shut behind them. The hum faded slightly, but it didn't stop. Tim was unconscious, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The aftermath. They got out of the factory and back to the diner, where Carol and a few others were waiting. Tim didn't wake up for 2 days, and when he didn't remember what happened. But his hair, once dark brown, had turned completely white. The hum stopped the night they went to the factory. No one heard it again, but the dreams didn't go away. People still saw the woman with no face, still woke up gasping for air, still felt the faint vibration under their feet when the wind blew just right. Sheriff Russell never spoke about what he saw in that basement. He retired a year later and moved out of town. But sometimes, late at night, when he was alone in his new house, he swore he could hear it again, that low, terrible hum calling his name. The library that shouldn't be there. Greyfield was a town where nothing much ever happened. Its biggest claims to fame were the 4th of July pie-eating contest and a fountain in the park that sometimes worked. People liked it that way. Change in a town like Greyfield wasn't just unwelcome, it was unnatural. So when a new building appeared overnight on Main Street, the whole town took notice. It wasn't just the speed of its arrival that was strange. The building itself was peculiar, a library, but not like any library the townsfolk had ever seen. It was old, impossibly old, with stone walls that seemed weathered by centuries, and a spire that pointed accusingly at the sky. The sign over the door read, "The Greyfield Archive." No one had seen it being built. One day it wasn't there, the next it was. And no one could remember the lot ever being empty before, though they couldn't quite agree on what had been there instead. A shoe store, a hardware shop, something else? By the time the sun rose, the doors were open, and a figure stood behind the counter inside, a librarian, the librarian. Her name was Miss Verity, or at least that's what the brass nameplate on her desk said. She was tall and thin, with hair the colour of iron and eyes that seemed to see through a person. She dressed in black, as if she were attending a funeral, and her voice had a melodic quality, like the whisper of pages turning. "Welcome to the archive," she said to the first visitor, a nervous teenager named Megan Price. "Feel free to browse. You'll find what you need." Megan wasn't sure what to make of that, but she wandered the aisles anyway. The shelves seemed impossibly tall, stretching up into shadows that the lights couldn't reach. The books were old, their spines cracked and titles faded, but when she pulled one down at random, she nearly dropped it. It was her diary. The handwriting was unmistakable, the doodles in the margins all hers. But it wasn't just what she had written, it was what she would write. The final entry detailed a conversation she hadn't yet had, one where she would confess her feelings to a boy named Ethan. Her face burned as she read the words. How could this book exist? How did they know? She slammed it shut and fled, the sound of Miss Verity's laughter following her out the door. Books that shouldn't exist words spread fast in Greyfield. The library had books that shouldn't exist, books that knew things. Some people, like Megan, found books about their futures. Others, like old Mr. Callahan, found books about their pasts, things they had never told a soul. Callahan's book detailed a crime he had committed in his youth, a theft that had never been discovered. "Who told you about this?" he demanded, waving the book in Miss Verity's face. "The archive knows," she said simply. "It knows everything." Some people stopped going altogether, spooked by the idea that their secrets might be laid bare. Others couldn't stay away, addicted to the possibility of learning what might happen next. But no one could shake the feeling that the library itself was alive, watching, listening, waiting. Rewriting the past things took a darker turn when Bobby Jenkins, the town's star quarterback, found a book that described the car accident that would end his career. He read it over and over, panicking with each turn of the page. And then he had an idea. He took the book to Miss Verity. "Can I change it?" he asked. "Can I make it not happen?" She smiled, thin and sharp. "The archive provides what is needed, nothing more, nothing less. But sometimes a story can be edited." Bobby didn't ask what she meant. He just grabbed a pen from her desk and scratched out the part about the accident, writing in his own version of events. He'd play in the state championships. He'd win. The next day, Bobby didn't show up to school. Or the next. When Sheriff McAllister went to check on him, he found the boy sitting in his room, staring at the wall, his eyes vacant. On the desk was the book, now blank except for a single line. "Some stories are not meant to be changed. The librarian knows." By now, the town was in a quiet uproar. People whispered about Miss Verity and the archive, wondering where it had come from and what she really wanted. Sheriff McAllister decided he'd had enough. He marched into the library one evening, his badge gleaming and his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you doing to my town?" Miss Verity looked up from her desk, unperturbed. "I'm merely the custodian," she said. "The archive exists to preserve stories, all stories." "Then why are people getting hurt? Why are they disappearing?" Her smile widened. "Stories have power, Sheriff. Sometimes they demand a price." McAllister slammed his hand on the desk. "Enough of your riddles. Who built this place? Who put you in charge?" Miss Verity's eyes gleamed. "The archive has always been here. Just because you didn't see it before doesn't mean it. Stories have power, that much is certain. They shape us, haunt us, and sometimes, if we're not careful, they consume us." In Greyfield, the archive left behind more questions than answers. Was it a warning, a lesson, or simply a reminder that some things are better left unread? No one knows. But one thing is clear. In a world of stories, there are some that should never be told. Just because you didn't see it before doesn't mean it wasn't watching. A town without answers. The next morning, the library was gone. The lot on Main Street was empty again, though no one could quite agree on what had been there before. Some swore it was a shoe store, others thought it was a hardware shop. No one saw Miss Verity again, and the books vanished with her. But the dreams lingered. People dreamed of towering shelves and shadowy aisles, of pages turning on their own. They dreamed of stories they tried to forget, and stories they prayed would never come true. And sometimes, late at night, if you walk down Main Street, you could hear it. The faint rustle of pages turning in the wind. Pumpkin Scary is your go-to channel for hair-raising tales, creepy adventures, and Halloween-inspired fun. From spine-tingling ghost stories, subscribe for a frightfully good time, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a scare. Spiderweb Ghost.